On June 15th, at Mount Mercy Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, a groom was shot dead at the altar in front of 75 guests. And the killer, the bride's mother. But this wasn't a crime of madness. It was a crime of calculated revenge for a murder no one knew had already happened 12 years ago. Brandon Mitchell had built the perfect life. At 34 years old, the Dallas real estate developer was the city's most eligible bachelor. Charming, successful, wealthy, and respected. His engagement to Sophia Hartley, a beautiful woman from one of Dallas's most prominent families, seemed like the final piece of a pristine puzzle. The wedding was planned with meticulous detail. The church was booked. The guest list included 75 of Dallas's most influential people. Everything pointed to a fairy tale ending. But fairy tales don't end with someone dead at the altar. Like this video if you think rapists deserve to face justice in a courtroom, not at an altar. Comment if you think the system failed Riley. Subscribe if you believe victims deserve to be heard. And share this story. Make Brandon Mitchell's name a warning, not a secret. 3 weeks before the wedding, Margaret Hartley, Sophia's mother and a self-made entrepreneur, discovered something that would shatter her family forever. She found an old leather journal, Brandon's journal, hidden in a property he was selling. What she read inside detailed a crime so disturbing, so deliberately hidden, that it set her on a collision course with a truth that had haunted her family for over a decade. The diary entries were from 2012, when Brandon was just 22 years old. They described in explicit detail a relationship with a young girl named Riley Hartley, Margaret's younger sister. But Riley hadn't been a willing participant. She was 16 years old. What Margaret uncovered wasn't an isolated incident. She hired a private investigator who found corroborating evidence, hospital records, therapy notes, even Riley's own diary that confirmed everything. But Riley hadn't lived to see justice. She'd taken her own life 8 years ago, leaving behind a 3-year-old daughter and a family that never understood why their bright, artistic sister had been broken. Now, Margaret understood. And the man who broke her sister was about to become her son-in-law. Margaret faced an impossible choice. Tell her daughter the truth and destroy her wedding, or let a predator slip through the cracks of a failed justice system once again. She hired investigators. She collected evidence. She documented 3 separate victims, including a new one from his college years that no one had ever reported. But as the wedding day arrived, Margaret made a decision that would echo through Dallas for years to come. She wouldn't just expose Brandon Mitchell's crimes. She would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. On the morning of June 15th, Margaret Hartley walked into Mount Mercy Baptist Church with a revolver in her purse and 12 years of buried rage in her heart. By that afternoon, Brandon Mitchell would be dead. Sophia's wedding would become a crime scene, and a family secret would explode across national headlines. But the real question wasn't whether Margaret pulled the trigger. The real question was whether justice had finally arrived, or whether it had simply arrived wearing a different face. This is the story of what happened when a mother decided to do what the law could not. To understand how a mother could walk into a church with a loaded gun and end a man's life at the altar, you have to go back. Not to the morning of June 15th, not even to 3 weeks prior when Margaret found the diary. You have to go back 12 years, to 2012, to a summer night that changed everything. A night that no one in the Hartley family was supposed to remember. Because secrets have a way of staying buried until something forces them to the surface. The discovery. 3 weeks before the wedding, Margaret Hartley stood in the middle of an empty house in Dallas's Lakewood neighborhood. sunlight streaming through bare windows. At 58 years old, she'd built a medical device manufacturing empire from nothing. She knew how to read a room, how to assess value, how to spot when something was wrong. That's why she'd come to this property personally, despite her busy schedule. Brandon Mitchell was selling it. The up-and-coming real estate developer had a reputation for pristine properties and meticulous attention to detail. Margaret was considering it as an investment. She walked through the downstairs. Hardwood floors, updated kitchen, professional staging. Everything looked perfect, but something felt off. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, checking the bedrooms. Master suite, guest room, office. Then the smallest bedroom at the end of the hall. It was empty except for a closet. And when Margaret opened that closet, she noticed something odd. A heating vent that didn't quite align with the others. She pulled at it, expecting nothing. A leather-bound journal fell into her hands. It was old, worn, with a familiar name embossed on the inside cover in silver lettering. Brandon Mitchell, 2012. Margaret almost put it back, almost didn't look inside. But something, intuition, fate, or perhaps her sister's ghost reaching out from beyond the grave, made her open it. The first entry was dated June 3rd, 2012. Met someone interesting at the charity event tonight. Young, beautiful, malleable. I think I can make this work. Margaret's hands began to tremble as she read. The next entries described meetings, grooming tactics, manipulation. There was a name, Riley. The handwriting described how easy it had been to gain her trust, to isolate her, to convince her that what was happening was normal, even romantic. Riley Hartley, Margaret's younger sister. The entries became more explicit. Brandon had documented everything with the clinical precision of someone who believed he was untouchable. The entries detailed a night in a hotel room, written with disturbing pride. But what made Margaret's blood run cold was a single line near the end. If she tells anyone, I'll say she wanted it. Who will they believe? A troubled girl or a successful young man building his career? The final entry was dated July 2012. I'm leaving Dallas. This was fun, but it's time to move on. I'm going to Texas to start fresh. She'll get over it. They always do. Margaret closed the journal. Her hands shook so violently, she nearly dropped it. 12 years. 12 years of not knowing why her sister had changed. Why Riley had become withdrawn, angry, self-destructive. 12 years of watching Riley spiral into depression, substance abuse, and finally, suicide. Margaret looked at the journal in her hands. Then she looked at the heating vent where it had been hidden. She knew in that moment that the hiding place had been intentional. Brandon had left this house deliberately, and this journal with it. Perhaps he'd forgotten about it over the years. Perhaps he'd kept it as some kind of twisted trophy. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Margaret Hartley now held proof of a crime that had been invisible for 12 years. And Brandon Mitchell had no idea that his past was about to catch up with him. Margaret didn't sleep for 3 days after finding the journal. She hired a private investigator named Paul Garrison that same afternoon, handing him the leather-bound diary and a single name, Riley Hartley. What Paul uncovered was a meticulously documented trail of evidence that made Margaret's hands shake every time she reviewed it. Hospital records from 2012 showed Riley checking into the emergency room with trauma injuries. The intake notes referenced an intimate assault. Therapy records, which Riley's parents had never known about, documented sessions where Riley described coercion and manipulation by an older male. Most damning was Riley's own diary, which Paul discovered stored in a safety deposit box. In Riley's handwriting, entry after entry described Brandon's grooming tactics, the promises he'd made, the threats he'd issued, and then the single line that confirmed everything. He said no one would believe me. He said I wanted it. He's right. No one will believe me. 3 days before Margaret's daughter's wedding, Paul sent her a new file. His investigators had found 2 other women, one from Brandon's college years, who'd dropped out without explanation, another from his early years in Dallas who'd moved away and never pressed charges. The pattern was undeniable. Margaret sat in her study, staring at the photographs, the statements, the evidence. Her phone buzzed with wedding planning reminders. Sophia was her only daughter. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. Margaret opened her purse and placed the revolver inside, the one she'd purchased that morning at a gun range. The salesman had asked if it was for personal protection. She'd answered yes, but not the way he'd understood. She looked at Riley's photograph on her desk. Smiling, young, full of life. The way she'd been before Brandon Mitchell stole something that could never be returned. Margaret picked up her phone and dialed Sophia. "Hi, honey," Sophia answered cheerfully. "Are you excited for tomorrow?" Margaret closed her eyes. "We need to talk," she said quietly. The reception was in full swing when Margaret grabbed Brandon's arm. "We need to talk," she whispered. "Now, outside." Brandon's charming smile faltered for just a moment. No one had ever spoken to Margaret Hartley's tone before, but he followed her anyway, confident in his ability to charm his way out of whatever this was. The garden behind Mount Mercy Baptist Church was beautiful in the June evening. Roses in bloom, the stone gazebo glowing softly in the fading light. Margaret led him there, away from the music, away from the guests, away from anyone who might interrupt what was about to happen. She pulled out the manila envelope. Brandon's face went white as he recognized his own handwriting. The diary. His diary. The one he'd forgotten about, the one he'd thought was buried in a house he'd long since sold. "That's impossible," he whispered. Margaret's voice was ice. "I have hospital records, therapy notes, I have Riley's diary, and I have 3 other women who are willing to testify about what you did to them." Brandon's shock transformed into something else. Rage, desperation, calculation. "You can't prove anything," he said, his voice dropping. "That diary could have been written by anyone. And Riley? She was a child," Margaret cut him off. "You were 22. She was 16. I was young. I didn't know better." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Margaret replied, pulling out Paul Garrison's investigation report. "You wrote about manipulating her. You wrote about threatening her. You calculated that no one would believe a troubled girl over a successful young man." Brandon's hand moved toward his jacket. Margaret's hand moved to her purse. "You're going to turn yourself in," she said. "Tonight. We're going to the police together. Or—" She reached into her purse. Brandon saw the revolver, and he ran. He bolted from the gazebo back toward the church. His wedding reception suddenly transformed into a crime scene waiting to happen. Margaret followed him, the gun still in her hand. The moment of no return had arrived. Brandon's dress shoes slapped against the marble floor as he ran through the reception hall, past tables of half-eaten food and confused guests. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to get away from Margaret Hartley and the revolver in her purse. He burst through the church doors into the main sanctuary. The altar loomed before him, the place where just hours ago He'd recited vows, promised to love Sophia forever, built a future on lies. Behind him, Margaret entered the church. She wasn't running. She was walking with purpose, the revolver hanging at her side. The remaining guests began to notice. Conversations died mid-sentence. People stood up from the pews. Sophia emerged from the reception hall, calling out, "Mom! Brandon? What's happening?" The priest, Reverend Samuel Cormick, stepped forward from the vestry, confused. "What is the meaning of this?" Brandon reached the altar and turned to face Margaret. His charming facade had completely shattered. His hands shook. His eyes were wild with the realization that his carefully constructed life was collapsing in real time. "You can't do this," he pleaded. "You'll destroy my life." "You already destroyed Riley's life," Margaret replied, her voice steady, controlled. "You destroyed 3 other women's lives, and you were about to destroy my daughter's." "I was young," Brandon said again, desperately. "People change." "I've changed." "No, you haven't," Margaret said. She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo. Riley. Riley smiling. Riley alive. Riley before Brandon Mitchell had touched her. "This is my sister. She was 16. You were an adult. You knew exactly what you were doing." Sophia screamed, "Mom, put the gun down!" But Margaret didn't lower the revolver. She looked at her daughter, then back at Brandon. "You were going to marry into our family," Margaret continued. "You were going to become our son-in-law. And my daughter would have never known that her husband was a predator, that he'd raped her aunt, that he'd hurt innocent women and walked away without consequence." "The law isn't your responsibility," Reverend Cormick said, stepping toward Margaret. "The law failed Riley," Margaret replied coldly. "The law failed all of them." Brandon made a decision in that moment. Perhaps he thought if he charged toward Margaret, he could overpower her. Perhaps he thought if he reached the door, he could escape. Perhaps desperation simply took over. He lunged. Margaret didn't hesitate. The gunshot echoed through the church with a sound like thunder, like judgment, like 12 years of buried rage finally released. Brandon's white dress shirt bloomed crimson as the bullet struck him in the chest. He fell backward onto the altar steps, gasping, his hands reaching toward a sky he would never see again. Sophia screamed her husband's name. The guests erupted in chaos. Women shrieking, men rushing forward, someone already calling 911. Margaret lowered the revolver. She looked at the body of Brandon Mitchell bleeding out on the altar where he'd promised to love Sophia forever. She looked at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. And she whispered, so quietly only Sophia could hear, "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Police sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. Justice, in the form of a bullet, had finally arrived. The trial of the state of Texas versus Margaret Hartley lasted 4 months. The courtroom was packed every single day. Media, spectators, victims' advocates, and ordinary people trying to understand how a mother could shoot her daughter's groom at the altar. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Margaret Hartley purchased a revolver on the morning of June 15th with the intent to kill. She brought it to a wedding. She confronted the groom. She fired a single shot that proved fatal. That was premeditation. That was murder. But the defense's case was more complicated. They introduced Brandon's diary into evidence. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the entries were read aloud. His calculations, his manipulations, his boasts about what he'd done to Riley. Paul Garrison testified about his investigation. He walked the jury through hospital records, therapy notes, and Riley's diary. He described how he'd found 3 other women willing to testify about Brandon's predatory behavior, though none had pressed charges. Then Margaret took the stand. For 3 days, she recounted her sister's story. She described finding Riley's suicide note 8 years ago, confused and devastated, never understanding why her bright, artistic sister had wanted to die. She described the moment she found Brandon's diary. She described the investigation that revealed the pattern, the grooming, the manipulation, the calculated predation. "Did you intend to kill Brandon Mitchell?" the prosecutor asked. Margaret met his eyes directly. "I intended to see him face justice. I brought the gun because I was prepared to ensure that happened, one way or another." "So you planned to kill him?" "I planned to stop him," Margaret corrected. "He chose to run." The defense brought character witnesses, teachers, employees, community leaders who testified that Margaret was a woman of principle, of integrity, of deep moral conviction. A woman driven not by malice, but by a mother's desperate need to protect her child and to honor her sister's memory. The jury deliberated for 11 days. When they returned, their verdict was split. Guilty of manslaughter, not murder. Guilty of using excessive force, not premeditation, Margaret Hartley received 15 years in prison. As she was led away in handcuffs, Sophia stood in the courtroom. Their eyes met for just a moment. Margaret mouthed, "I love you." Sophia wept. Margaret sat in the prison library at Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She worked as a librarian's assistant, helping other women navigate their sentences, their traumas, their regrets. She'd become a mentor to younger inmates, women who'd fought back against their abusers, women who'd broken the law trying to protect their families. Sophia visited once a month. They sat across from each other at the visitation table, talking carefully about neutral topics. The weather, Sophia's work as a trauma counselor, the books Margaret was reading. "One visit?" Sophia asked. "Do you regret it?" Margaret looked at her daughter for a long moment. "I regret that it happened the way it did. I regret that you lost your wedding day. I regret that I couldn't find another way." "But do you regret what you did?" Sophia pressed. Margaret thought about Riley. She thought about the other 3 women, the ones whose names she'd learned, whose stories she'd heard. She thought about Brandon's diary, still in evidence, still being studied in law schools as a case study of predatory behavior. "No," Margaret said finally. "Not for a second." Sophia didn't argue. Instead, she reached across the table and held her mother's hand. Outside the prison walls, life continued. Riley's name was attached to a new victims advocacy organization. Brandon's diary became evidence in a national case study about sexual predators and systemic failure. The case was cited in legal textbooks about vigilantism and justice. One question remained unanswered. Had Margaret Hartley committed murder, or had she delivered justice that the system had failed to provide? The answer, it seemed, depended on who you asked. You just listened to a story about how a predator almost got away with it. Almost. But he didn't. Like if you believe every victim of sexual assault deserves justice. Comment. What should happen to men like Brandon Mitchell? Subscribe to this channel for stories that expose predators and demand systemic change. And most importantly, share this story. Share it with your daughters. Share it with your friends. Share it with anyone who needs to understand that predators like Brandon Mitchell exist, and they're counting on silence to survive. Don't give them that silence. Like, comment, subscribe, share.